It's time to increase your bankroll by decreasing your daily fantasy sports learning curve. The Curve with Benny Ricciardi and Josh Kalashi starts now.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Curve here at rotocurve.com, where our mission is to help accelerate your DFS learning curve and get you over that hump to profitability. My name is Benny Ricciardi. I go by BRich11 on all the daily fantasy sites, and I'm here today with my partner and co-host, Josh Kalachi. Josh, how we doing this morning, buddy?
Doing good, doing good. Another full slate. Yesterday was too many slates. There was that early slate. There was only 2 games. I think there was an 8-game slate in the afternoon. But today we're back at it. There's one early game at 2, but we have a full slate of 14 games tonight. Looking forward to it. Should be a good show. We got a good one for you guys. Looking forward to talking about baseball again.
Yeah, we have there is one early game if anybody out there is playing for the early start. It's not a slate all by itself, but there is a Cubs I forget who the Cubs are playing today, but the Cubs do have a 2 o'clock start. Cubs and Brewers has a 2 o'clock start, so you can find a couple early start games on both FanDuel and on DraftKings today that include that game, but it's literally the only one starting early. Everything else is at 7, so everything else is running on the same normal schedule with 14 games tonight. So there's a lot of guys to talk about, a lot of stuff to do. So let's get on into it. As always, we're going to start out with a recap of yesterday for you guys. Then we'll move on and talk about some of the weather concerns we see. We'll go take a look at the Vegas lines and see what they're telling us. Then we'll move on, start talking about some pitchers today, start talking about a couple hitters that we want to make sure that we're on. Josh and I are going to give you guys a little bit of our baseball knowledge today to kind of show you with the situation that popped up with the pitching change that we had late that we'll get into later. And as always, Josh and I at the end of the show will give you our cornerstones, the guys that we're going to be putting in our lineups and building around. It's been a pretty good week for our cornerstones, so if you guys were using those and you were able to put the right other guys with them, you probably had a pretty profitable week. So before we get into tomorrow, though, do you have anything about yesterday or the day before that you want to let the people know about?
Yeah, last time we spoke was 2 days ago. We had a big show for you guys, and it was a big slate, 15 games. It was all about Garrett Cole. It was all about those value bets. Everybody was on, including myself, was on King Felix. There was a good pitcher, Carlos Martinez. They both had decent nights, but not great. They didn't reach the value, but they were still able to contribute to some catching lineups of 50-50s and head-to-heads. Now, the big story about that night was all the value bats. It's talking about guys like Jordy Mercer for the Pirates, the Dodgers stack with some of their low-price guys, Jock Peterson, Andre Ethier. Adrian Gonzalez and Nelson Cruz hit home runs. That was big for both of our lineups, I'm sure, and sure many others. But for last night, yesterday was different because there was an early slate and a late slate. Thursday, as always, in the MLB is a travel day. It was never really a full slate, especially as we get into the dog days of summer, as a lot of baseball people like to call it. I didn't play much last night in the late slate because there wasn't many great matchups to target. There was some weird things ended up happening. We'll talk about that in a little while. But obviously with a whole bunch of different things happening in the sports world last night, I felt it was a good night to kind of stay away and recharge for today. But in the early slate yesterday, it was a lot of fun. There was a game in the Cardinals and the Phillies where there was just a ton of runs scored, a ton of runs were projected to be scored, and a lot of people to stack that game had a decent evening. Darren Ruff hit a home run. Matt Carpenter had 20 points, which is just like another day at the office for him. But let's talk about last night real quick because it's something really interesting happened with that Twins game. Chris Sale got crushed by the Minnesota Twins lineup, which some people did expect. I know there was one guy that believed in stacking him, and that's why he ended up winning a tournament. But I don't know if I could ever stack a lineup like the Twins against a pitcher like Chris Sale, Benny. Could you see that happening?
I mean, it definitely isn't a play that I think would go often. In GPPs, those big tournaments, I mean, sure, if you're trying to be different. But here's actually the thing that I got out of that last night. I had Chris Sale in some of my cash games last night, and I still managed to cash. Now, you're probably thinking, how do you do that when you have a pitcher who finished up with -7? But in this particular cash game, it was a 50-50 on the lineup that I had him in and still wound up in the money. He was 67% owned. Just like we said the other night with Felix Hernandez. When Felix Hernandez didn't have a great game, he was 70% owned. So even if these guys don't have a great game, you can still use them in your cash games because, again, if the cash line's 50-50, there was only 30% of the people who didn't have them. So if those 30% are the ones that you figure probably are going to make the cash, well, there's still 15 to 20% of people out there who had to make it into the money even with those guys on their roster. So, that's why we say even if you don't think that, obviously if you don't think the guy's going to be a good play, then you don't play him. But with these big high-priced studs that should be studs, that's why you play them anyway in your cash game because, for a tournament, you might want to try to go with somebody cheaper to get a little bit more upside. But for your cash games, you're looking for the safest points. And even if these guys don't make it, like we always say, it doesn't hurt you if you have them if everybody else has them too. I mean, I didn't have Chris Sale in all my cash games last night. I actually ran 2 cash lineups. But even a cash lineup that I did have him in, I still won more than 50% of those games last night because basically the guy who I was playing had Chris Sale too, so it's a wash. And that guy gets knocked right out of there, and then instead of playing, depending on what site you're on, instead of playing 9-on-9 or 10-on-10, you're playing 8-on-8. And there's nothing wrong with that. If your 8 guys can outscore his other 8 guys, that's the name of the game. That's the point. That's why we tell you guys, play in some of these cash games. Because in the GPPs, if the guy isn't over 80% owned and you had Chris Sale last night, like I said, I made a couple 50-50s where I was still able to cash with Sale. I didn't come anywhere near any of the tournaments last night with the the lineups I had Sale on. Just like the other night. I mean, the other night when when King Felix kind of blew up, if you had King Felix in your tournaments, you probably didn't do as well. You really needed to have Garrett Cole. Maybe if you had Cole and Felix together, you might have gotten over that hump. But without without the top pitcher on a day, it's very hard for you to find yourself in the money in any of these big tournaments, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And I was looking at those scores last night. It may have been one of the lowest scoring nights I can remember in MLB Daily Fantasy. I think I saw some 50-50s that were cashing, and I saw somebody cash with 62 in one game. Now it's rare, but in some tournaments somebody cashed with 81. It's incredible.
And just to put that out, you're talking 62 on DraftKings, not on.
Yes, correct.
Where that's
correct. Yeah.
62 on DraftKings is that's. I mean, there's been times where you can get that just from your pitching. But last night, that was the problem though. I mean, last night, I mean, who were the best pitchers last night? You had Shelby Miller, who was pretty good, and he actually wound up getting the loss, but he finished with about 25 or 26 points. I think Mike Leake might have been the nuts last night, right? I mean, he went 7 innings, no runs, something like that. Most of the other guys, I mean, you had Sale was like a -8. You had 3 or 4 pitchers that were less than 5 points on DraftKings. I mean, when stuff like that happens, it's, like we said, it's one of those nights where you probably should have taken off. There was, a lot of crazy stuff that happened last night.
Yeah, no doubt, and that brings us to tonight, as we always like to detail right after we talk about the night before. It's time to get into what we're all here for, to today's slate. And the first thing that we always like to look at is weather, because that's the first check mark. If we have a bad weather game, you got to stay away from it. Luckily, I don't think we have any weather games tonight. There's no rain as of now, but there are 2 games that you might have to look at for wind. LA against San Francisco, there's 10-mile-an-hour wind straight out, which will give a little bit of a benefit to the power hitters. The only other wind game is the Diamondbacks against the Dodgers. That's 9-mile-an-hour wind straight out. So it's not too much of a boost, but just a little bit. And if the wind's not blowing in, it's not going to hurt the hitters. Now, as for rain, there's nothing that could affect the games right now, but there is a thin band of weather approaching Illinois right as we speak right now. It doesn't look like it's thick enough that would potentially cancel any games. There's also another band of weather that's in the Northern Virginia, Maryland, Delaware area, but that's nowhere close to any of the games that will be played tonight. So those are just the only 2 things that are popping up on the radar for the United States right now, but it doesn't look like it's going to affect any weather. So be sure to keep an eye on it, but there shouldn't be much risk. Is there any Vegas lines of note today, Benny?
Yeah, there's a couple things that are interesting that I was looking at. For starters, we have the Mets and the Nationals taking each other on tonight. It's a matchup of 2 great pitchers. Matt Harvey and Max Scherzer are going up against each other. The line actually opened at 6. I've seen it at down to 5.5 in some places. So if you're thinking about using any bats in this game, it's probably not a very high, high probability of them paying off. I mean, they're basically expecting these 2 guys to put up a whole bunch of zeros, strike out a whole bunch of guys, and the way I look at it, it's probably going to be one of these two bullpens that blows it in the 8th and 9th inning for, whichever one of these guys happens to give way first. There are two other really low-scoring games today. The first one is the Los Angeles Angels and San Francisco Giants. That game's in San Francisco. Again, like we always talk about, game being played in a pitcher's park. You get a run total of only 7 on that one, so that's one that you might want to keep an eye on some of the bats for. And then the other game tonight, which is a little bit surprising to me, is Colorado and San Diego is only at 7 as well. But again, it's in a pitcher's park, San Diego, where I'm actually in the midst of working on a ballpark factors article that we're going to have up on the RotoCurve site sometime in the next couple days. That kind of gives you guys an outline of which parks are pitchers parks, which parks are hitters parks, different kind of hitters that do better in one park or another. So when we talk about it during the show, you guys could actually use that as a reference and give you some ideas of, what I mean by a pitcher's park or a hitter's park, and pretty much what the numbers say and why we consider certain parks to be better than others when we're going through it. But those are the only 3 really low-scoring games. Like I said, there's 2 at 7, San Diego and Colorado, the Angels and the Giants, and then the Mets and Washington at either 6 or 5.5, depending where you're looking at it, is obviously the lowest scoring one. So that's the one that I would really advise you to stay away from most of the bats in that game. As always, we also have a couple high-scoring games to talk about. Detroit and Kansas City is another one of those games with a 9-run total. They have been expecting big numbers over there all week, and for the most part, I don't think we've really had incredibly high-scoring games between those two. They both have pretty solid defenses, especially Kansas City. So they've been able to limit Detroit's bats a little bit. People, I think, were expecting a lot more out of those Detroit bats. And surprisingly, for those who don't know, the Royals are actually one of the best hitting teams in baseball right now. They have one of the highest batting averages in baseball. They were 1 and 2 with Detroit. The Royals were first. Detroit was second. I don't know if that's still the case. I haven't looked in the last couple days, but again, those are two teams that can hit the ball. So 9 runs there, doesn't seem all that crazy. The other 2 games with 8.5 run lines are Oakland and Texas. Now, one of these is interesting because the Oakland game, Scott Kazmir's going, and he's a pretty big favorite. They're not expecting him to give up a lot of runs, which means that they are expecting Oakland to score a lot of runs on the other side of that game. So that's something that like I always said, you want to look at. If you have a really good pitcher going in a game with a high run total, it's not something that's going to scare me off Kazmir by any stretch of the imagination. Basically, all it does is make me push up some of those Oakland bats because I'm thinking those Oakland bats are going to explode for a couple runs tonight. And then the last game with the high total is the Boston Red Sox and the New York Yankees are going at it today. And that one I'm pretty sure is up in Boston. That's an 8.5 run total on that one. And for those of you who live in the Boston or New York area or follow the Red Sox-Yankees rivalries, from anywhere around the country, you know that when these two teams get together, you throw everything out the window. It could wind up being like a 13-12 game, where the bats on both sides just start pounding out hits. So that's another one that you may want to make sure you have some exposure to tonight, both in your cash games and in any tournaments that you might be playing as well, because we've seen it before where those two teams go back and forth, and at the end of the night, there's a 22-run line or a 24-run line or something like that, and if you don't have any exposure to that many runs, it's probably not going to be a good night for you. So those are the high and low run totals for the day. We'll move on to some of the pitching favorites. The biggest favorite on the mound today, Josh, I'm going to ask you a question. Who do you think the biggest favorite on the mound is tonight?
I'm going to go with somebody in that Washington game. But you got to remember, there's another pitcher on the other side, so that throws some things off. You might have to target some other pitchers. Who is that favorite?
The biggest favorite on the day today is actually Tom Kohler at -165. And again, you basically said exactly the reason. While Harvey and Scherzer are both studs and are probably the 2 best pitchers going tonight, neither one of them is going to be the biggest favorite because they're going up against each other. So each one of them is just as likely as the other one to go out and throw an 8-inning shutout or a 1-run game over 7 or 8 innings. So with the Vegas line on that game, it's pretty close on both sides. It was actually -115 this morning, -115 and +110. Scherzer was the favorite, but I've actually seen it as low as -108 for both of them, which basically makes it a pick'em. For those of you who play like basketball or NFL betting lines, whenever the 2 pitchers are within like 5 or 10 points of each other, we basically consider it a pick'em in baseball. because it's not much of a difference. They're basically giving him about a 50 to 55% chance of winning, and the other guy getting like a 45 to 50% chance of winning. So, it's about as close as it can be in that one. There are two other pretty big favorites. One of them is the Dodgers pitcher. They're throwing up the young kid, I think it's Frias today. So he's minus 145. And Scott Kazmir is also minus 145. So he's of the top price pitchers, of the guys who could be studs, he's the biggest favorite of the guys who, you always expect to give you a good game. And then the only other guy who's even remotely close up there is Ian Kennedy at minus 140 against the Colorado Rockies, which really surprised me because he's been a little banged up. He hasn't really been pitching all that great, but again, he is at home in San Diego, which is a pitcher's park, so that might have a lot to do with it altogether. But again, normally we try to target some of these big favorites in our games today, but other than really Kazmir, there's not much that makes me say, like, this is a must-start kind of guy. Those other guys aren't really high strikeout guys or guys who normally go deep into a game. So pitching is not going to be easy tonight. But with that being said, we're going to, try to talk you guys through it as best we can and some of the things that we see. So, Josh, you want to start the people off with some of your pitching picks for today and, kind of let them know which way you're looking?
Yeah, for those of you who've watched the show before, we love to pay up on pitching, especially in 50-50 and head-to-heads, and we still advise that is the best thing to do. Now, that doesn't just mean pick the two most expensive pitchers or two guys that cost a lot, because there's more to that. You have to look at the matchups. When I first looked at the slate, I saw Matt Harvey and Max Scherzer, and I thought, oh, those are the two best pitchers. Let's go with those two. But they're facing each other, and you don't want to do that in your 50-50s and head-to-heads because it limits your chances of getting a win for both sides because literally there's no shot. It can't happen. The chances of getting one win is high because one of the two starting pitchers, the majority of the time, will get a decision. But as Benny said earlier, it could limit the ability for most guys to for these two guys to get a win because both pitchers are great. They can strike out a lot of hitters and go deep into the game. And we could see a 2-1 game or a 1-1 game when these pitchers come out. So there's a chance both of these guys couldn't get a decision. That being said, I would target one of them, and I think that's Harvey for me, simply because Scherzer is too expensive. The Mets saw Scherzer 3 weeks ago, and Scherzer did pitch well. But most of the Mets never saw him before. You can't discount that. Max Scherzer came over from the American League with the Tigers, and the Mets have a very young lineup. They've never seen a pitcher before. The reason why I like Harvey over Scherzer, especially the fact that he's cheaper, is he faces the Nationals in a big park in Citi Field. They're very deep the alleyways, despite the fact that they've actually decreased the length of the fences in the last 2 years. But the Nationals are hitting just .239 against righties. They have the 6th highest strikeout rate, and Harvey can do just that, strike out a lot of hitters. We've seen him go, I believe, 6 or more innings in each one of his starts. His pitch count is starting to increase a little bit. Now, he's not going to throw 120 anymore. That just doesn't make any sense for him recovering from this injury that he seems to be all the way back from at this time. But in order to do that, you're going to have to pair somebody else with him. And with there being some bat that you might want to spend up on, it's not worth going with him and Scherzer because, like we just talked about, one of them can't get a win if you do that. And if you're relying on a game flow that benefits two guys, and that what we talk about with game flow is that means that both of those guys have to be in a low-scoring game. And the chances for that to happen, although are likely, it's something we can't rely on. So there's two guys that I would like to target. Benny's going to talk about one of them, and I'll talk about the other. Lance Lynn for me today against the Pirates. The Pirates are an absolutely mythical matchup, and the reason I say that is because I wrote a piece up on the site earlier. You can check it out on rotocurve.com, detailing the better recent performances for pitchers in the past week. All three of them were against the Pirates. Think about that. We saw guys like Ruby De La Rosa, Jason Hamill, Anthony DeSclafani, who also pitches today. All of them had 28 or more fantasy points on DraftKings and I believe 15 or more fantasy points on FanDuel, all against the Pirates. Now, that's saying something. That's not a coincidence. If that happened 3 times in a week, and I think it happened 4 or 5 times with 2 other pitchers, but they didn't have as high of a point total.
Yeah, that's that's a good point that Josh was bringing up right there. Is
they're striking out.
Go ahead, you back, buddy?
No, go ahead. Yeah, we're good.
Yeah. Basically, that was a good point that Josh was bringing up. If you look back over the recent game logs, sometimes you're going to see that there are certain teams that just keep, basically not hitting. And if you look at that Pirates team right now, obviously their biggest bat is Andrew McCutchen. And McCutchen just doesn't look right. I mean, he's still banged up. He has some injuries. He's been playing through them, so I don't blame him at all because, the guy's trying to give everything he's got out there. But especially right now, if you're playing McCutchen in fantasy right now, it's probably not a good idea. Even though he is one of the best players in baseball when he's right now he's not right. And for the price that you have to pay for him, he's not producing up to the level that he needs to produce at. But to fill in on something else that Josh was saying before, yesterday, for those of you who were in the chat room with us, when we were talking about the early game, I had mentioned that it might be a good idea to use two pitchers that are in the same game for the early slate. Now, whether you decided to pick the St. Louis Philly game or to pick the LA Angels and Oakland Athletics game, there is some merit to picking two pitchers in the same game if it's a small slate like that. And yesterday was one of those days where it actually worked because both of the pitchers in the starting pitchers in that Philadelphia game, both of them wound up with either a negative number or a very low single-digit number. So if you did happen to put Chavez and Richards in your lineup, you had the two top-scoring pitchers on the day. Now, obviously, that really didn't matter unless you stacked up most of those bats from the Cardinals and added in a Darren Ruff with it, because that was basically the way to win yesterday with all the runs that they wound up scoring. But on a large slate like tonight with 14 games, you have to take a stand. If you're going to use either Harvey or Scherzer, you're using either Harvey or Scherzer. You can't use them both in a day like today and expect for that to wind up paying off for you. And again, when we're looking at our cash games, what we want to look at is who's the guy that's most probably going to get me the top score on the day. And for me, I can't decide which one of those two guys I would like to have more. I don't knock anybody who decides to use Scherzer or to use Harvey because they're both studs. But there's no certainty in it for me on which one is going to be the one who I should use. And that's why today my top pitcher is actually Scott Kazmir. Kazmir's a minus 145 favorite. So far he has 30 strikeouts and 30 innings worth of work. He's 2-0 on the season, .99 ERA, .88 WHIP. So, I mean, he's basically pitching about as well as anybody in the league is so far, giving up less than one run per start, giving up less than a hit per inning, striking out at least a batter per inning. I mean, that's exactly all the things that you want from a starting pitcher when you put a pitcher into your lineup for fantasy. And to top it off, he's a left-hander going up against the Texas Rangers lineup. That Texas Rangers lineup has the fourth most strikeouts against left-handed pitching of any team in the league so far in 2015. So you figure at a minus 140 favorite, he's got a high probability for a win. Going up against a team that strikes out a lot against left-handed pitching, he has a high probability of getting at least a strikeout per inning, if not more. And Kazmir's a guy who's been going 6 or 7 innings in every one of his starts. So if you can get a guy who's going to pitch deep into the game, strike a lot of guys out, and is probably going to wind up with the win, I mean, that's exactly what you want from your pitching today. And to top it off, on FanDuel, he's a little bit expensive. He's 9,200, so he's not that far of a drop from the guys like Scherzer and Harvey. But he's still somebody who I think is in play on FanDuel. But if you look over on DraftKings, he's like the 6th or 7th highest priced pitcher. He's 7,400, which to me just seems way too cheap for a guy who has the kind of upside that he does. I know he's getting a park switch going from Oakland to Texas, but that Texas lineup doesn't scare me, and I don't really think that, it's worthy of him getting a $3,000 discount, basically. I mean, he's 30 to 35% cheaper than the guys like Harvey and Scherzer who are up top. And, like I said, he's got a good chance for strikeouts. He's got a good chance for a win. He's got a good chance to pitch deep in that game. So, to me, I think that's just the steal of a price today. So, for me, the top guy who I'm going to be using in all my cash games is going to be Kazmir. I don't disagree with what Josh said about Lance Lynn before he got cut off. Lynn's in a good spot tonight as well. I also think that you need to look at guys like Carrasco and DeScalfani. I don't love Carrasco's matchup today. DeScalfani's matchup I like a little bit better against that that Atlanta Braves team. They're not really great, even though they have a couple bats that have been hitting pretty well, and they do have a bunch of left-handers they can throw at him. But, DeScalfani's been a stud so far to start the season. So I think those are some other guys that you might want to take a look at. Definitely for your tournaments. For your cash game, like I said, 1-pitcher site, I'm rolling Kazmir. 2-pitcher sites, I'm putting him in, and then I'm going to have to figure out who I want to use with him because there's a couple options. There anything you want to add to that as well, Josh?
Yeah, just between those three guys, between a Matt Harvey, Max Scherzer, or Lance Lynn, or for you, Scott Kazmir, you have to pick two of them. And I think for me today, I'm probably going to end up going with Lynn and Harvey because of those matchups and their ability to go deep into games. But you make a great case for Kazmir, and like you said, on DraftKings, his price is very low, and it's almost too low to ignore, especially with the cap relief he provides.
Yeah, I mean, he's basically cheaper than DeScalfani and Carrasco today. And I mean, nothing against both those guys. They're both solid young pitchers, but I mean, like I said, Kazmir's been lights out to start the season. So to me, I think that somehow there's a pricing mistake there. So I think you got to take advantage of it when you see it, because that extra money that you're saving by using him is going to allow you to put some pretty big bats in your lineup. Some bats that we're going to get into right now. That was basically what we think of the pitching for today. We're going to get into the hitters. While we get into the hitters, there's a couple teaching points along the way that we're going to jump in and throw at you guys. There's also one change that I wanted to make sure everybody was aware of. If you did any of your research last night or earlier this morning, Trevor Cahill was the scheduled starter for the Atlanta Braves, and they actually changed it up to a guy named Mike Foltynewicz, who we'll talk about a little bit later because there's a couple bats that we're going to be targeting against him. And then, as always, we'll finish off with with our thoughts and which guys we're going to be using as our cornerstones. But let's start at the catcher position like we usually do. Josh, what are you thinking about catcher today? What's your thoughts on the position?
We're switching roles today, Benny. The last couple of days or last couple of shows, I know you've talked about.
Yeah, well, what Josh was going to say is the last couple of shows. Sorry, go ahead.
All right, I think we're good now. We might be back on. So what's happening for Vogt is he's in the top three in that order. Not a lot of catchers can do that, especially at his price. So considering the fact that he's hitting in the top three, he's playing in a lineup with a lot of guys that are getting on base, he's facing Colby Lewis as well. And Colby Lewis, we talked about earlier, is projected to give up a lot of runs, and he's given up a lot of hits so far as well. 30 base runners in just 24 innings of work. Vogt's right in the middle of that lineup, and that's exactly why I'm targeting him against a pitcher like Lewis, as who Benny always refers to as a bit of a gas can. So what we're going to do with Vogt is he's more expensive than a lot of the other hitters, but if you are going to pay up a catcher, he's the guy to target. Benny, do you have a little bit of a cheaper guy, or are you looking at an expensive guy that could hit a home run?
No, I mean, basically compared to Vogt, the guy that I'm using is very expensive today, and I don't know why, but DraftKings completely jacked his price up. So if anybody has looked at the prices yet, you know that the guy I'm talking about is Brian McCann. McCann is the cleanup hitter for the Yankees. He's had multi-hit games in 4 of his last 6, so he's basically seeing the ball pretty well right now. And he gets a matchup today with Justin Masterson of the Boston Red Sox. Now, Masterson's a guy who struggles against left-handed bats. Last year, he gave up a .320 batting average to left-handed bats, and already through this year, he's given up a .275 batting average in the early part of the season. So the way to basically get at Masterson is with left-handed hitters, and especially left-handed hitters who have some power, kind of like McCann does. Now, it's tough for lefties to hit home runs up there in Boston, so I'm not expecting him to go yard today, but hitting in the middle of that Yankee order, I definitely think he's a guy that you want to keep your eye on. Now, I'm going to put a little caveat on this. As I said at the beginning, for some reason, his price on DraftKings was completely jacked up. I think he's almost $5,000 on DraftKings, $4,900 or $4,700, which is a lot of money to spend at the catching position. If I'm spending $4,900 on somebody, the way you got to think about it is, you could probably only fit 1, maybe 2 guys into your lineup that cost $5,000. Do you really want to spend that $5,000 on a catcher, though? That's the only thing that gets me, because basically by using a guy like McCann, you're knocking out some of those big first base options or some of those, stud shortstop like a Tulo or a Hanley or some of the studs in the outfield. If you're using Brian McCann, you're using him instead of, putting an expensive outfielder like a Mike Trout or like, Matt Kemp or like guys that are up in that range. So as much as I like McCann and think he's one of the best catchers on the day, I'm shying away from him on DraftKings because of the price. But on FanDuel, I think he's $3,100 or $3,300. That's definitely a reasonable price. That's definitely something that will fit into your lineup. And again, left-handed bats are the way to go after Masterson. He's the cleanup hitter for the Yankees. That's a high total game. So there's a lot of things that make me think that there's going to be some runs scored there. And, with McCann being in the middle of the action, he's a guy I think is going to have a piece of it. But, that's basically summing it up for catchers. There's a couple cheap options that I'm going to throw out there that you guys might want to keep an eye on as well. One guy is Brayan Pena from Cincinnati Reds. He's a lefty bat that's going to be going up against this Fulty Newitz guy that's going to be starting for Atlanta. He's very cheap. I think he's only $3,000 over on DraftKings. So if you need to save some money and come down, I don't think Volt's very expensive. I think he's about $3,800. So he's definitely somebody that's in play. But if you need to come down and you need a cheap guy, I think Pena is somebody who can get it done for you. And depending on how things work out, you also always got to keep AJ Pierzynski on your radar, because he's been hitting really well. He's still really cheap, and as long as he's hitting cleanup, he's in one of those lineup positions that you can't really ignore him. And if you used him at all this week, you know that he's been producing and making money for you. So there's no reason to shy away from him now. But that pretty much sums it up for the catcher's position. Let's move on to first base. I know Josh has a guy who tends to fly under the radar at first base that I actually really like and used a lot last year when he was in Washington. Do you want to tell people a little about your pick for first base today?
I like Adam LaRoche a lot today as a cheap option. I do think that there's one guy we should be targeting, and Benny, I think you're going to be talking about him in a little bit. But The reason why I like Adam LaRoche is because he faces Kyle Gibson, who induces a lot of ground balls. Now, you've heard me talk about before, I like pitchers that induce ground balls, but think about LaRoche's swing for a little bit. He has a massive uppercut, and the plane of his bat is close to about 45 degrees, which is perfect for a lefty against a ground ball pitcher because that ball goes right in the wheelhouse. If Gibson can get the ball up just a little bit, it'll be right where LaRoche wants it, and he can hit the ball out of the ballpark. That being said, there is one guy I think that should be in your lineup. Is that right, Benny? Joey Votto?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Votto, like I said yesterday, I started my lineups yesterday with Adrian Gonzalez and built around them. Today I'm going to be starting my lineups with Joey Votto and building around him. Now, when I originally did the research for this, as we said, the guy who was supposed to be starting for Atlanta was Trevor Cahill. Cahill's a right-handed pitcher. The guy they have in starting right now is a guy named Mike Fulty Newitz, and he's also a right-handed pitcher. Now, I don't know too much about him. He only pitched about 18 innings last year in the major leagues, but we were looking up, some of his stats and trying to get some information on him, Josh and I, before the show. And basically what we found out about this guy is he's a really hard thrower, but he throws the ball very straight. And for those of you who aren't baseball guys, basically what that means is the ball that he throws is very hittable. He's one of those guys that is going to strike out some of the people who don't have good bat speed to get around on him. But the guys that can get around on him, he's one of those guys where, when you were in Little League and there was some kid who threw hard and your coach used to say, just get the bat on the ball and, he'll make the way he throws, that'll make the ball go if you can just make contact. Well, that's kind of the way that Fulty Newitz is. I mean, he can get his fastball up into the high 90s, but it's a very straight pitch. There's not a lot of movement. As Josh was explaining to you guys the other day, he doesn't throw a heavy ball, so the ball just comes in straight and it's very easy to hit. So with a guy like that, he gave up in 8 innings last year, which is a very small sample size, so I don't want you to put too much into it. But the stat that I'm going to give you is pretty telling. In 8 innings last year of relief pitching against left-handed batters, he gave up 3 home runs, 10 runs, 13 hits, and 4 walks. So he basically had a whip of about 2. He had an ERA that was a little bit closer to 11, and he gave up about a home run every 2.5 innings. So if you have a guy who is doing that against left-handed batters, you really want to make sure you target some left-handed batters. Now, when you're looking at the Cincinnati team, the biggest left-handed bat that they have in that lineup is Joey Votto. And Votto's a guy who hits well against right-handed pitching. He hits for average. He hits for power. He gets on base because he will take a walk here and there if they don't throw him anything to hit. So he's a guy who definitely has the right profile to go up against a guy like Fulty Newitz. I actually even like him more now than I did when Cahill was supposed to be on the mound, because basically he's the exact kind of guy that you would want in this situation. He's a little bit pricey on all the sites today, but that's because he's been producing. So if you're playing on DraftKings, I think he's $4,700. If you're on FanDuel, he's $4,000, and if you're playing over on Fantasy Aces, he's one of those guys in that $5,400, $5,600 range where in order to fit him in, you're definitely going to have to take a punt somewhere. But again, like I said, he's one of the guys that I'm putting in my lineup and building around. We had the same situation yesterday with Adrian Gonzalez, and he came out and hit a home run in his first at bat the other night. So it's definitely somebody who is still worth the money, even though he's a little bit expensive. And the good thing about him being expensive and playing a position that has a lot of options is it might actually keep his ownership rate down. So I think he could be the top scoring first baseman on the day at decent ownership. with a pretty square price for the production that he's going to give you. So definitely for my tournaments, he's somebody that's in there. And right now, I'm even plugging him into most of my cash games and going from there. If I have the money left over to spend, a couple places you got to come down off him if you want to get some stuff in in other positions. But he's definitely the top first baseman on the day. I'm going to throw one other first baseman out there for you guys. Not going to get too deep into the numbers with him, but Mike Napoli is a big right-handed bat in that Red Sox lineup. He should be hitting in either the 3, the 4, or the 5 hole today, depending on how they jostle those guys around with Big Papi and Hanley Ramirez, depending who starts. But CC Sabathia is pitching for the Yankees. Sabathia he's not the guy that he once was. Right-handed bats have been lighting him up so far this year, and he's really struggled. So Napoli is a big power right-handed bat, which is basically what's been giving CC trouble. And he's going to be in the middle of that lineup on DraftKings. I know he's only $3,800, so he's very, very well priced. And over on FanDuel, I know he's cheap. I think he might even be below $3,000 if I'm not mistaken, or right around there. So if you're looking for a cheaper option at first base, Mike Napoli is definitely somebody else that I would recommend for today. But that kind of sums up first base. Let's move on to second. Who's your top pick today at second base, Josh?
I think we both have to target one guy, and I think everybody else does as well, but he's expensive. We'll talk about him in a little bit. But if you do plan to go cheap at second base, the guy that I'm targeting is Odubel Herrera from the Phillies against Tom Kohler. Herrera hits in the top 3 of the Phillies order and can score in many different ways. He can run the bases well. He scores runs. He can actually hit a little bit for power when guys are on base in front of him. But he's incredibly consistent. He's reached base at least once in the last 10 games, and I think he has over 5 fantasy points on DraftKings and 8 of his last 10 and over 2 on FanDuel. So he's very cheap, but he can produce consistently, and that's something you want to get. But as for the play at second base, I think you got to look no further than Jose Altuve. Somehow you got to fit him in. Is that right, Benny?
Yep, that's right. I mean, we go over it and we say this stat all the time. He's going up against a left-handed pitcher today. It's not a great left-handed pitcher. The guy's name is Roenis Elias. He plays for Seattle Mariners. He was actually decent last year. He wasn't horrible against right-handed batters. He had a .257 batting average. He did give up a lot of long balls, though. He did give up 13 home runs to right-handed batters last year. But again, the stat that you want to really concentrate on here with Altuve is whenever there's a left-handed pitcher on the mound, last year against left-handed pitching, Altuve hit .414. Now, again, if you're hitting .310, .315, .320, that's good. That's great. You're going to be one of the guys who makes my short list of people to target. If you're hitting .414 against left-handed pitch, if you're hitting .414 against left-handed pitching like Altuve did last year, you're not only a target, you're a cornerstone that I'm going to be building my lineups around every day. Now, there's more than just that going in Altuve's favor as well. I mean, this is a guy who's been on a hot streak and has been putting up a lot of points. Let me get the numbers right here. Altuve has been double-digit DraftKings points in 8 of his last 9 games. The one game he did fall short of double-digit DraftKings points, he had 8. So in his last 9 games, his worst output has been 8 DraftKings points. Over the course of those 9 games, he's averaging 16 DraftKings points per game. So even though his price has jumped up on DraftKings to $5,000, if he's averaging 16 points a game for you, he's basically getting you more than 3 points per $1,000 of cost. Now again, if you start with $50,000 salary and you're getting 3 points for every $1,000 that you spend throughout your lineup, you're going to have a final score that's above 150. A score above 150 cashes 95% of your head-to-heads. It's going to be in the top 50 in all of your. It's going to be in the top 50% in all the 50-50s you play, and it's also probably going to be not only in the money but pretty high up in the money in a lot of these tournaments. So if you can have a guy that can consistently produce like that for you, that's why I said even though Altuve's getting expensive, the way he's playing right now, he's still a guy that you have to plug into your lineup. There's pretty much no way you can get around it. Would you agree with that, Josh, or is there, anyone else you think can get you anywhere near those kind of points today?
I don't think so. And one thing Benny said about Altuve is he hit .414 against lefties last year. He's not doing that this year. He's hitting .560 against lefties. Now, that's a very limited sample size, but .560 is an incredible number. That means he could go over his next 14, and he's still hitting .400, even with that sample size. The guy just matches lefties, and excuse me, every time you find those guys, you're going to have to plug them in your lineup, especially at his price. And Benny talked about yesterday or two shows ago, you got to pay up for second base, and that's one of the guys you have to do it with today at Altuve. You plug him in and figure out the rest of it later.
Yep, I mean, that's, basically what we always try to make you guys understand is you want to do the things that are the highest probability. You want to put yourselves in the best situation to score the most points. If you know that there's a guy that, like Josh just threw out the stat, I mean, the guy's hitting over 500. So if he gets 4 at-bats today, he's more than likely to get at least 2 hits. I mean, if you can put a guy in your lineup who you know is going to do something like that, it's just like free points that you're getting, and you can just move on to the next spot. So that's how we feel about it. Like I said, Altuve's another one of those cornerstone guys. He's expensive on all the sites. He's $5,000 on DraftKings now. I think he's up at 44 or 45 on FanDuel. So he's not easy to fit in. But again, with the production that he's had, you really can't argue with it. So that's our ideas on second base today. Like I said, pay up for Altuve. Josh gave you a nice swerve if you wanted to come down if you don't have that kind of money. But let's move on to third base. I know there's a third baseman that you like, and everybody already knows who I'm going to say. So why don't we let you start this one off with your third baseman?
I think my third baseman today is a guy that's similar to Adam LaRoche, but he plays on the other corner, and that's Trevor Plouffe. He's a right-handed hitter who has a home run swing against a left-handed pitcher. Plouffe faces Quintana today, who struggles in giving up the long ball to right-handed hitters. And Plouffe doesn't do too much other than hit home runs every now and then, and that's what I don't want to say I'm banking on, but he's definitely a type of guy that can hit a home run, and I would be using him just in tournament options. But at third base, just like every other day, I think we got to go with probably Benny's favorite athlete on the history of the planet, and that's Matt Carpenter. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I'm very happy right now because I'm starting to hear other people talk about this guy in the same light that I do. He's a guy who is hitting over 300 every year, scoring close to 100 runs every year. I mean, those numbers, he doesn't have the big sexy stats that everybody looks at. He's not stealing 40 bases. He's not hitting 40 home runs. But, I mean, this guy is a great baseball player. And even more than being a great baseball player, he's a great fantasy baseball player. He has at least 8 DraftKings points in 7 of his last 9 games. And his price has been right around that $4,000 mark on DraftKings. So he's getting you over 2 points per $1,000 that you're spending on him. So he's a cash game player. Like I said, I mean, I say it every day, but he is literally a guy who you can plug and play in your cash games almost every day of the week. He's that consistent, he's that good, and he has that kind of upside where he's even a play when you put him into your tournaments today. And the reason why I say that is they dropped him from the 1 hole down to the 2 hole, so he now has guys hitting in front of him. The knock on him has always been that as a leadoff hitter, he doesn't get you any RBIs. So the only way he scores points, he basically hits a single. He's not a big base stealer. He'll steal a few, but he's not a guy who's going to steal and get you points that way. So he basically hits a single, and then somebody knocks him in, and he winds up with 5 points per at-bat for you. Which, again, I don't understand how that's a knock on the guy, but that has been the knock that people had said is, he doesn't have great upside. Well, now that they dropped him into the 2 hole, he now has some big bats hitting behind him that can still drive him in, but he's also in a spot where he's getting up more often now with runners on base. And again, he's such a consistent hitter, and he's so good at putting the ball in play that the more times he gets up with people on base, the more times he's going to be able to knock those guys around. So finally this year, I think we're going to see a big RBI year out of Matt Carpenter. I'm not saying 120 RBIs, but he might get into the 80s, maybe even the 90 RBIs this year. And he's still going to be scoring close to 100 runs, and hopefully he's still going to be hitting a little above 300. So if you can put all those things together, he's going to be in a good spot. Now, he is a left-handed bat. He's going up against A.J. Burnett today, who's a right-handed pitcher. Burnett's not really a great pitcher at this stage of his career. He's very up and down. He still is a decent strikeout pitcher. He can get guys out when he needs to. But he's also been giving up a lot more hits, and he's been getting hit hard. Guys have been getting good shots on him, not necessarily home runs, but, a lot more balls that they've been driving on him. He's been giving up a lot of shots to the outfield. So with a guy like Carpenter, who's such a professional hitter, I definitely can see him putting the ball in play a couple times and winding up with a couple hits today. So, I have a man crush on him. He's one of my favorite players in baseball, and he's definitely going to be a guy that I'm rolling in all of my cash games today. So third base, if like I said, if you're willing to spend up, he's a little expensive again, $4,400 on DraftKings. I think he's about 38 or so on FanDuel today. He's 48 or 49 over on Aces as well. So he's not cheap, but for the consistency that he gives you over the course of the last couple games, he's definitely a guy that I would be plugging into my cash games today, using him in my 50-50s, using him in my head-to-heads. So let's move on to one of the toughest positions. And I think Josh and I are kind of in agreement on DraftKings today. I think there's really only one way to go on DraftKings. But on FanDuel, you could probably go a different way. But you want to tell people a little bit about who you like at shortstop?
Yeah, it's another high-priced option, which I might not be able to get him in all of my lineups because you have to end up on one position, but you're going to have to go with some cheaper guys at the other position. But the big guy today at shortstop is Hanley Ramirez. He checked.
Yeah, again, Hanley Ramirez is the guy who I'm on.
Those boxes that he checks and just.
That Hanley Ramirez is the guy that I'm on in shortstop as well. Josh, you want to give people the case of why you're using Hanley today?
Yeah, he's facing CC Sabathia, who, as you said earlier, he's not the same guy. He's getting the fastball in on righties, but not far in enough, and that's exactly what Hanley Ramirez can do. Is he's going to get that bat extended with that 300-foot wall on left. If he doesn't hit it over the wall, he's going to hit it off the wall at least once today. So if you're giving him 5 points for a double, if there's guys on base, which there can be with his spot in the lineup, there's going to be guys scoring for him. He's got a chance to hit some RBI. And I think you have something written down. How many home runs does he have in his last 25 at bats?
Yeah, he's in his last couple games. He's 9 for his last 25 with 5 home runs. I mean, that's pretty telling stat. And to be honest, Josh, there's actually a third choice with him. It's not even just he's going to be hitting the ball over the wall. The way this guy's been hitting, he actually hit a ball last week that went through the wall at Fenway Park. I have never ever seen anybody do that before, but he literally dented the wall at Fenway Park. That's how hard. They say that the ball comes off his bat at over 100 miles an hour. It's like the fastest it's ever been clocked. I don't know if it's his bat speed or the way that he torques and the way he swings, but apparently the ball comes off his bat faster than it comes off of the bat of any other player, in the majors right now. So much so that his manager actually said at some point this season he's going to hit a line drive and kill somebody. So that's, just another thing about Hanley Ramirez to like here today. And again, I agree with everything Josh said. 9 of his last 25, 5 home runs. He's a right-handed batter going up against CC Sabathia. Sabathia is a left-handed pitcher struggling against right-handed bats. If you're playing on DraftKings, find a way to fit this guy in as your shortstop. He's also eligible in outfield if you'd rather use him there. But for me, the drop-off between Hanley and everybody else at shortstop on DraftKings is so massive that if you can fit him in your cash games, you're going to have such a huge leg up on anybody who doesn't use him. But again, he's not shortstop on every site, so if you are playing over on Fantasy Aces or on FanDuel, another guy who I would take a look at is Marcus Semien. He's the number 2 hitter right now in Oakland. Doesn't have the best splits matchup today, but he also isn't going up against a great pitcher, so I'm okay with that. And this guy is kind of like a poor man's Altuve. All he does is hit the ball. I mean, last night I think he had 3 of 4, or 2 days ago he was 3 of 4. Since they moved him up into the 2 hole, he has 7 hits and 12 at-bats. That basically means the guy's hitting over 500 in the last 3 games since they've moved him up. So if you have a chance to, use a guy like that, he's still pretty cheap, although his price has come up almost everywhere based on his recent production. But again, I like the lineup that he's hitting in. I like the guys hitting in front and behind him, and I think he has a pretty good matchup today. So on sites where I can't use him or in places where I can't fit in Hanley Ramirez, Semien is definitely an option that I'm going to be considering and, probably rolling out there in a couple of them, especially on FanDuel. I think he's only like 3,100 on FanDuel, so he's not too cost prohibitive for you. You'll be able to fit him in there. But now we're going to move on to outfield. And, oh, go ahead, Josh. I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was just going to add one more shortstop for everybody that you're going to have to use some cheap guys somewhere. And the only other guy, a similar situation to Semien, is Jordy Mercer, who has been hitting second in that Pirates order. He's priced under $3,000 on both FanDuel and DraftKings. I don't know what his price is on Aces, but I'm sure it's a little bit cheaper over there as well. So be sure to take a look at him because of his lineup spot if you can't afford to spend up on a guy like Hanley and you're not impressed with Semien for today. But I do like Semien as well.
Yeah, so we're going to actually move on now to outfield, and Josh is going to give you an outfielder that he likes, and that's going to lead us actually into our first teaching point on the day about using your knowledge of baseball and what you know about the game along with the numbers to kind of give you an advantage. So Josh, you want to take that away?
Yeah, we'll start off with the outfielder and a little bit why. It's Jay Bruce. I'm targeting him today against Mike Foltynewicz for the Atlanta Braves. Now, Benny alluded to earlier, we were going to be discussing Foltynewicz because he's not really a known commodity yet in the major leagues. He only pitched 18 innings, but what we do know is he was very good against right-handed hitters. And And that brings up to our good point, how to use numbers and what we can use about the game we know in baseball and how to translate those numbers to the statistics. And that's how we're able to find out good plays for the day. There's been a big debate about using statistics and knowledge of the game. I still think the best way to do it is to use both. Use every piece of information that you have available to you, and that's the best way to make a lineup, in my opinion. But how we use that is Fulton Wicks has a very high what's called infield fly ball rate against right-handed hitters, and that's exactly what it sounds like. He's making a lot of righties pop up, and that indicates that he has a little bit of a late movement on his ball into right-handed hitters. Now, that could be a changeup, that could be a fastball. Benny alluded to, he throws the ball hard. Now, why I like Bruce is because he gives up a lot of home runs to left-handed hitters. 3 home runs in 8 innings. Now, that is a small sample size, but as Benny said earlier, if a guy's throwing hard but it's flat, and that means there's not much movement to the left-handed hitter, it's going to go a long way. And if that ball only tails away, for a guy like Bruce who has a really long swing, he's just going to get right on that barrel. Benny, do you have any other outfielders you want to discuss before we get into the teaching point?
Yeah, well, there's 2 other guys. You know, as you guys know, if you look back through the infielders that I gave you, they're all pretty expensive today. So the place that I'm going to be saving a little bit of money is going to be in the outfield. And there are 2 guys that I really like. The first one is Melky Cabrera. Cabrera is much better from the left side of the plate. He goes up against a weak right-handed pitcher today in Kyle Gibson. I'm expecting the Chicago White Sox to get to Gibson today, and Melky bats 3rd in that order. So he's either 2nd or 3rd in that order. He's right in the middle of the action. He's got some of the big bats like Abreu and LaRoche hitting behind him. So when he gets on base, he has guys that can bring him in. What I like about Melky is he's a high batting average kind of guy. Even when he's not taking PEDs, he's still a guy who's going to be hitting in the 310, 320 range. He has that kind of ability. He's a switch hitter. He can go from both sides of the plate. So even if they bring somebody else in later in the game to pitch, he's still going to be in a pretty good spot. And he's a guy with a little bit of power, a little bit of speed. And the thing that I really like about him is, for somebody who bats up as high in the order as he does, he seems to be like a forgotten man where people just really don't play him all that much in fantasy. And his price is pretty cheap. Over on DraftKings, he's a little more pricey. I think he's $4,200 or $4,300. But on FanDuel, he's a $2,500 player. So if you can get a guy who's $2,500 hitting up towards the top of the order in a game where you're expecting a bunch of runs, that's really, really, really cheap. And again, he's in the right splits matchup for him. He's going up against somebody where he gets to bat from his preferred side. He's a high batting average kind of guy. He's averaged about 3 points per game over his last 10 games, which again is not huge upside, but when you're talking about a cash game, if you can get me a guy on FanDuel who's going to get me 3 points and is only going to cost me $2,500, I'm okay with locking in that kind of guy. I mean, he's been getting a hit every game almost. He's getting on base. He's walking. He's scoring some runs. I mean, he does a little bit of everything. So for tournaments, I don't know if he has huge upside. I don't know if he's a guy I'd throw in there for huge upside in a tournament. But if you're playing in these cash games and you want somebody who's safe, he's been as safe as he can be, and he's very, very cheap. So he's definitely somebody that I would put in there. The other cheap guy that I'm looking at is Ryan Rayburn from the Cleveland Indians. Whenever the Indians play a left-handed pitcher, Rayburn is the guy who comes in. That Cleveland Indians lineup is very left-handed dominant. So when they play a left-handed pitcher, they try to rest a couple of those lefty sticks that they have in there, and Rayburn is the one guy who they put in there who can hit him. So they put him in as the righty. He is so good against left-handed pitching that for a guy who's in a platoon split, when it's his turn to play, he hits 4th or 5th in that order depending on who they have around them. He's usually right behind Carlos Santana. Sometimes Santana's 3rd and Rayburn is 4th, depending on who they have setting the table in front of them. Sometimes Santana's 4th and Rayburn's 5th. But he's definitely another guy that's in play. And again, he's a guy who's incredibly cheap. If you're playing on DraftKings, he's $2,900 today. If you're playing over on FanDuel, he's $2,300. And I think if you're playing on Aces, I didn't look up his price yet, but I'm assuming he's probably somewhere around $4,000 over on Aces. So if you're trying to fit some of these studs in and you need to get some of those cheap bats in, Rayburn's a guy who's going to be hitting in a good spot in the lineup. He's going to be 5th. He has the right splits matchup today. He has a lot going in his favor. And again, anytime he plays against a left-handed pitcher, he's one of the better hitters against left-handed pitching in the league. So you're getting a guy at a discounted price that could produce like a stud today. So whether it's in cash games or whether it's in tournaments, I think Rayburn's another option that you have. And again, with all the guys that we gave you in the infield that are going to be a little pricey, you're going to need to put guys like Milky and Rayburn in your lineup in order to be able to, basically get where you want to get. But with that being said, Josh, let's get back to that teaching point, about knowing the games and the numbers and how to use them for everybody.
Yeah, it's a perfect way to combine everything, and everybody has always asked me and always talk about for every sport, especially baseball, which I still believe is one of the biggest games of numbers that we're going to find. It's one of the things we like to use is like guys like ground ball rate and line drive rate. You've heard us mention batting average for balls in play. Now, all these statistics are great, but if you don't know how to use them, it doesn't mean anything to you. And that's exactly what Benny and I are going to discuss now is how to use these and you put it with your knowledge of the game. And before the show started, Benny and I were discussing about Mike Foltynewicz and how he gets lefties or righties out, but not lefties. Now, how we figured that out is because we haven't seen him pitch much because he's only pitched in 18 innings. We looked at his numbers on Fangraphs, and we showed you that in a few shows ago. But he has a high infield fly ball rate, which we just alluded to, but gives up a lot of fly balls and not many ground balls. Well, what that means is he's getting a lot of guys to reach out for a pitch. Now, how we use these numbers to translate with the knowledge of the game is you see a guy who's throwing the ball hard, he's going to give up home runs. That's how it works. When you think about the game of baseball, you think about different ways that guys are able to hit the ball out of the ballpark, and it's simple physics. If a guy's throwing hard and a guy makes contact with the barrel of the bat, it's gonna fly out far, and that's what happens with Foltynewicz, and that's why he's giving up 3 home runs. Another thing that Benny and I always like to talk about is park factor. Now, obviously, more runs are scored in certain ballparks, and it's just history, and it's just what we've seen. But using what we know about the game is that can indicate things as well. Now, Benny and I always talk about guys like Jose Bautista and Nelson Cruz, who are dead pull hitters. Now, why would we want to target them in parks like Fenway Park or Yankee Stadium, Benny? Why would the park factor have something to do with guys that are pulling the ball like that?
Well, I mean, again, there are the dimensions of all the parks are different. Some places it's 330 down the line or 315 down the line, like the right field line in Yankee Stadium. Other places down the line, you might be going 360, 370, 380. So if you have a place where a dead pull hitter is going to be able to pull one that any other stadium might be a lazy pop fly, in a stadium like a Yankee Stadium or in a place like U.S. Cellular Field, that same pop fly is going to wind up going over the fence and being a home run for you. And, again, those are some of the things that the more you play, the more you just start realizing stuff like that. You hear people say things like, I'll target those left-handed bats in Yankee Stadium that pull the ball because they're going to put it in the short porch, or, other things along those lines like, oh, man, don't play anybody in San Diego. That place is that place chews up, hitters. They don't score a lot of runs there. There's a lot of fly balls, a lot of, basically a lot of room and foul territory where some of those lazy fly balls that would end up in the stands in most other stadiums wind up being outs over in San Diego, and really helping out pitchers, getting pitchers out of some of the jams that they might have been in otherwise. So ballpark factors is a big thing. It's definitely something that you guys should take a look at. As I said, I'm going to be having an article coming out in the next couple days about it, so make sure you give it a read. This way you have some idea. It's not the sole reason why we pick guys or why we don't pick guys, but when you have 2 guys that are pretty close that you're trying to decide between, it can definitely be the thing that pushes you over the edge. But with that being said, we're coming up on the hour right now. So, Josh, do you want to give people a little bit of an idea of who you're using as the cornerstones to build your rosters around today?
Yeah, I'm still deciding on pitchers, but that's the first thing I'm going to do. I'm going to have Harvey in my lineups. I know that's for sure. But on 2 pitcher sites like DraftKings, I have to figure out whether I want Scott Kazmir, who you sold me on, and I think his numbers are matching up well with his price, especially on these 2 pitcher sites, or Lance Lynn. But for now, it's probably going to be Kazmir. Now, we're going to wait until lineups come out, as always, as you should, before completely locking in your lineups. But in order to be able to fit these high-priced bats that I'm going to go after, like Hanley Ramirez and Jose Altuve, I'm going to need some cheap guys, and I think Ryan Rayburn is going to be that top value guy I go after. And I'll probably find some other cheap catchers, maybe like a Brian Pena, or depending if a Tucker Barnhart starts for the Reds. Whoever the catcher is for the Reds is usually cheap, and I'll probably target him and able to fit those top bats like Altuve and Hanley Ramirez. Are you going to be doing something of the same?
Yeah, I've pretty much agreed with everything that you said. Here's the way I'm looking at it, and here's what I want to throw out for you guys today. The guys that I really like today are high-priced infielders. That's just the way that it is. When you're looking through and you're trying to see who's in good spots, It just so happened that a lot of guys that I thought were in good spots today are high-priced infielders. Guys like Joey Votto, who I'm going to try to fit in. Guys like Altuve, who I want to fit in. Guys like Hanley Ramirez, who I want to fit in. I mean, even Matt Carpenter at $4,400 on DraftKings. Not overly expensive, but not really cheap either. So those are the guys that I want to fit in my lineup, and in order to do that, I'm going to have to save in other spots. Especially in my cash game lineups, I want as much certainty as I can have. As much as I like both Harvey and Scherzer, as much as I've recommended both of those guys before and used both of those guys before, when they're going up against each other, I have absolutely no certainty on which one's going to pitch better. So I have no certainty on which one's going to get the win, and on a site like DraftKings, if they don't get the win for me, it's going to be very tough for them to reach the value that I'm going to need them to reach, with the high prices that they have. And that's why it's so easy for me to come down to Kazmir, because he's only $7,400. And I have a very good feeling that he's going to be in a good spot to get the win. He's a minus 140 favorite. Like I said, he has a good matchup. He's going to be going up against a team that strikes out a lot against left-handed pitchers. He's a left-handed pitcher with a high strikeout rate. I mean, everything kind of lines up for it. And again, if he was 9,200, I'd probably still be on him today. But at 7,400, I can't, seventh or eighth most expensive pitcher on the site today, I can't see myself not putting him in lineups and building around him. And by doing that, I'm saving myself, $2,000 to $3,000 over those stud pitchers. So I'm going to have a little bit of extra money to spend up on bets. I agree 100% with Josh with the Rayburn idea. Ryan Rayburn's the guy who's going to be in my lineup. And basically the way that my lineup construction is going right now, I have a couple guys plugged in there who by the end of the day will probably not be the guys that are still plugged in there. When lineups come out later, I'm going to be looking for some of that value. If you get a guy like a John Jay leading off or a Jock Peterson leading off, if you get some of these guys that are around that, $2,800 to $3,500 price on DraftKings, you're probably going to need to use one or two of those guys today in order to fit in those high-priced, $5,000 bats that you really like around the infield. As much as I love McCann on DraftKings, I may wind up coming down to a guy like an A.J. Pierzynski because I think that I'm just going to need the price savings in order to fit the rest of them in. So I'm waiting until lineups come out to really round out my roster, but the cornerstones are going to be those infield guys that we talked about, the Hanleys, the Altuves, the Joey Vottos, the Matt Carpenters, and Scott Kazmir is going to be one of those guys who's in almost all of my lineups tonight. So that's basically the way that I see it. That's how I'm going to go about doing it, and hopefully I can build some winners around it.
For sure. That brings us right to the top of the hour and the end of the week. It's a big weekend in baseball. We got a lot of sporting events. Be sure to enjoy the fight tomorrow night if you're watching that. But we'll be back on Tuesday, May 5th at noon. Be sure to check out the RotoCurve website. I will have an article up later on the value plays for today. And Benny's working on that Park Factor article, so be sure to keep an eye out on that as well. But for Benny Ricciardi, I'm Josh Kalachi. This has been The Curve. Benny, you have one more thing left to say?
That's right. Good luck tonight, guys. We love you, and stay classy, DFS.